For the past 2 years, the narrative surrounding the Black Sea has been entirely misleading. We've been told that this front was frozen, balanced, or locked in a stalemate, but this assumption has completely shattered in real time. What has just unfolded is not a small shift or a minor adjustment. It's the quiet opening of what can only be described as the Odessa corridor. This move marks the most significant strategic defeat the West has suffered in this war, and it goes far beyond the typical headlines or battlefield maps we've been accustomed to seeing. What Russia has done here is not a mere tactical play. It is a monumental shift in the strategic balance. The opening of the Odessa corridor represents a direct assault on the economic and military heart of the Ukrainian state. But this isn't about taking a single city or threatening a port. It's about targeting Ukraine's maritime sovereignty and, by extension, challenging the credibility of the collective West. This is not an improvisational move. It's a strategic decision that has been in the making for a long time, and now it's unfolding with precision. This analysis won't follow the typical shallow patterns you've seen on television. There will be no emotional framing or recycled talking points here. What follows is a realist analysis grounded in military logic, geography, and geopolitical facts. It will align with the type of analysis championed by the McGregor doctrine: blunt, contextual, and unforgiving. We'll explore how Russia managed to open this corridor, why NATO is now signaling quiet panic, and why this development represents NATO's worst-case scenario coming to fruition. Russia has now effectively seized control over the sea lanes leading to Odessa, creating a protected shipping corridor on its own terms. In doing so, Moscow has pushed its operational perimeter deeper into the western Black Sea, shifting the entire conflict's geometry. The key question is not how Russia pulled this off, but why Odessa has always been the true objective. Odessa isn't just another Ukrainian city. It is Ukraine's last viable deepwater port. Before the war, Odessa and its neighboring ports were responsible for the bulk of Ukrainian exports, particularly grain and steel. These weren't symbolic exports. Ukrainian grain feeds large portions of the global south, while steel underpins industrial supply chains far beyond Eastern Europe. Control of the northwestern Black Sea is not just a military advantage for Russia. It's a move that puts Moscow in the position to regulate global food flows. This isn't just a regional war anymore. It's a conflict with the power to influence global markets. By opening the Odessa corridor, Russia has not only gained an upper hand in the conflict, but it has also gained leverage over global trade. The balance of power in the entire Black Sea basin has shifted. Now, the pressure is no longer just on Kyiv, but on NATO countries like Romania, Bulgaria, and most critically, Turkey, which controls the Bosporus and Dardanelles. This is the classic choke point strategy. Control a narrow geographic space, and you gain disproportionate political and economic influence. And the signals from NATO are clear. Behind closed doors, emergency consultations are underway. NATO has shifted its rhetoric from victory to stabilization, signaling increasing concern. Washington and Brussels are clearly uncomfortable with the current situation. NATO leadership is confronting a military reality it has long avoided. Russia still retains the strategic depth to mass forces and execute decisive objectives. This operation wasn't an accident. It was the result of careful, patient preparation. Russian supply lines were secured, air dominance was expanded, Ukrainian naval capabilities were degraded, and vulnerabilities were systematically exposed. Once again, Western leaders misjudged the importance of geography. NATO viewed Ukraine through the lens of a modern European state, but Russia saw it as a centuries-old security buffer on its southern frontier. This move reveals exactly where Moscow is willing to concentrate power, where geography, economics, and military force intersect to produce lasting leverage. To understand why Odessa matters so much, we need to look back further in history. The significance of Odessa didn't begin in 2022 or 1991. It stretches back much further to the late 18th century and the imperial ambitions that shaped Russia's control over the Black Sea. When Russia defeated the Ottoman Empire, Empress Catherine the Great launched the Novorossiya Project in 1794, a concrete geopolitical strategy aimed at securing a southern gateway for Russia. Odessa was founded deliberately as a warm water port that would resolve a long-standing strategic vulnerability for Russia. Geography had always imposed limits on Russian power. Northern ports were icebound, limiting trade, naval movement, and influence. Odessa was created to break that constraint. From its very beginnings, Odessa served the Russian Empire, becoming one of the most important commercial hubs. It quickly rose to become the fourth largest city in the empire. It was cosmopolitan, economically powerful, and strategically indispensable. Its role was clear: to channel the immense agricultural output of southern Ukraine onto global markets. Grain flowed outward, wealth flowed inward, and with it came diplomatic influence. Odessa wasn't just a port, it was a naval anchor and the centerpiece of Russian power in the Black Sea. The strategic importance of the coastline, stretching from Crimea, annexed in 1783, toward the Danube estuary, was never an abstract ambition. It was a consistent objective that shaped Russian military thinking for centuries. From the Napoleonic Wars to the Crimean War, and even through both world wars, Russian military strategy has been deeply rooted in this struggle for maritime dominance. This historical continuity is key to understanding Russia's present actions. Western strategists failed to grasp the depth of this objective because they failed to recognize that Russia's leadership didn't suddenly realize Odessa was important in 2022. This was always part of their strategic framework. To fully grasp why Russia's move on Odessa was inevitable, we need to look at the broader context of this conflict. The importance of Odessa didn't just appear with the outbreak of war in 2022, nor was it an outcome of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Its strategic value to Russia is much older, more deeply rooted, and fundamentally non-negotiable. To understand why Moscow was always going to make a move toward Odessa, we must trace the origins of its significance back to the late 18th century and the imperial expansion that shaped the entire Black Sea region. After Russia's defeat of the Ottoman Empire, Catherine the Great embarked on what came to be known as the Novorossiya Project in 1794. This wasn't a vague, broad ambition. It was a concrete geopolitical plan. Odessa was founded as Russia's southern gateway, an ice-free port that would solve a critical vulnerability in Russia's maritime strategy. For centuries, geography had restricted Russian power. Its northern ports were icebound for much of the year, impeding trade, naval movement, and the ability to project influence across Europe. Odessa was built to break that constraint, and in doing so, it became central to Russian ambitions. From its earliest days, Odessa served as a major port for the Russian Empire, quickly becoming one of the most important commercial hubs in the region. By the 19th century, it had grown into the fourth largest city in the empire. Odessa wasn't just a commercial center, it was a cosmopolitan city with significant naval importance. It was in essence a crucial tool in Russia's broader geopolitical strategy, serving as the center of its economic, naval, and strategic interests in the Black Sea. For Russia, control of the Black Sea's coastline, particularly from Crimea westward toward the Danube River, was never an abstract goal. It was a tangible strategic objective that guided military planning through major conflicts like the Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War, and both world wars. These conflicts, while shaped by many different factors, all contain the same core struggle: securing control over this vital stretch of coastline to ensure Russian dominance over the Black Sea and its surrounding territories. This continuity is important because it exposes a deep misunderstanding in Western strategy. Russian leadership did not suddenly decide in 2022 that Odessa was essential. It had always been central to Russian strategic thinking. The importance of Odessa was articulated early in the war as Russian commanders openly stated their objectives. The goal was never just territorial conquest. It was a strategic objective to secure southern Ukraine and establish a contiguous land and maritime corridor that would link Crimea to newly occupied territories in Ukraine. But this wasn't about ideological expansionism, as Western narratives often portray. It was about cold, calculated military logic. Control over the coastline means control over trade, the security of naval assets, and vital strategic depth in the face of external threats. Without Odessa, Crimea would be vulnerable. Its naval base, long considered Russia's southern fortress, would be exposed to interdiction and blockade. That vulnerability is simply unacceptable to Moscow. Western strategists, however, failed to appreciate this fact because they were viewing Ukraine through the lens of a modern European state. Russia, on the other hand, viewed it as a centuries-old buffer zone against threats on its southern flank. This difference in perception is why the move on Odessa was always inevitable. By focusing exclusively on the land war, Western analysts neglected the maritime and economic dimensions of the conflict. Control of the Black Sea, particularly the access to Odessa's port, was always the real strategic prize. Ukraine's maritime sovereignty was essential for its economic survival, but this was never fully acknowledged by the West, which continued to treat the war as a traditional land conflict. This oversight has now come to haunt NATO, as Russia has deftly exploited this gap. As the war wore on, NATO's focus narrowed further. The fighting in the Donbass dominated the headlines, and Western resources were channeled into a prolonged struggle in eastern Ukraine. When Mariupol fell, Odessa became Ukraine's primary economic lifeline. Yet NATO's response continued to focus almost exclusively on the land conflict, leaving the Black Sea to Russia's strategic advantage. This failure to recognize Odessa's critical importance ultimately proved to be decisive. Russia's strategy was methodical and patient. It wasn't about rushing into Odessa with a dramatic amphibious assault. Instead, Moscow employed a slow, calculated squeeze to gradually choke the region's ability to function. The goal was to isolate Odessa without needing to storm the city or engage in costly urban warfare. The strategy relied on attacking Ukraine's infrastructure, targeting key logistics hubs, and disrupting the military supply chains that kept Odessa operational. Over time, Russian forces systematically degraded critical infrastructure. Rail hubs, fuel depots, ammunition storage facilities, and port logistics were repeatedly targeted with precision strikes. The Zatoka Bridge, which connected Odessa to the rest of Ukraine, was a key target. The bridge was vital for the region's logistics, connecting Odessa to Romania, and its destruction signaled Russia's intent to sever Odessa from the rest of Ukraine. With this critical link damaged, Ukraine's ability to resupply the coastal region was severely hindered. Meanwhile, the Russian Navy adjusted its strategy, increasing its area denial capabilities and reinforcing its naval defense systems. Early in the war, Ukrainian naval drones had forced the Russian fleet to adapt. However, Russia maintained its core strength, using long-range anti-ship and land attack missiles to expand its effective control over the Black Sea. This wasn't a visible blockade created by warships. Instead, Russia created a passive blockade that deterred commercial shipping through the threat of missile strikes. Insurance costs skyrocketed, trade ground to a halt, and the Black Sea became a zone of Russian control by force. The land component of the strategy was equally effective. Russian advances in the eastern theater, particularly around key logistical corridors, forced Ukraine to commit its best forces to defend the Donbass. As Ukraine's most experienced units were consumed in these battles, the southern coastal sector, including Odessa, was left vulnerable. Ukraine couldn't afford to divide its forces, and the southern coast was sacrificed for the greater priority of holding the Donbass line. The Russian strategy didn't require a dramatic victory in Odessa. It only needed to isolate the region and control access to it. The result was a shift in the balance of power in the Black Sea. Russia now dominates the northwestern region of the sea, dictating the terms of trade and access. Odessa, once Ukraine's economic lifeline, has become a liability, unable to fulfill its role as a vital port due to the blockade. The opening of the Odessa corridor is not just a tactical setback for Ukraine. It is a direct challenge to the very heart of NATO's strategy and deterrence framework. This shift in the Black Sea marks a turning point not only for the region, but also for the global balance of power. What we are witnessing is the direct consequence of NATO's strategic missteps, which have allowed Russia to reshape the conflict on its terms. This move represents a massive blow to the credibility of Western deterrence and exposes the flaws in the alliance's policy of calibrated restraint. NATO's leadership failed to recognize the long-term significance of the Black Sea and its maritime dominance. Instead of viewing it as a key pressure point, the alliance focused almost exclusively on the ground war in Ukraine, which ultimately played into Russia's hands. By neglecting the strategic importance of Odessa and the Black Sea as a whole, NATO allowed Moscow to systematically dismantle Ukraine's coastal infrastructure and naval capabilities, leading directly to the opening of this critical corridor. This failure was not simply a tactical oversight, it was a strategic blunder. NATO's approach to the conflict relied too heavily on short-term solutions and reactive measures, while Russia was able to focus on its long-term objectives. The West's political and military decision-making cycles, driven by election timelines and immediate public messaging, simply couldn't match Russia's ability to plan and execute on a historical scale. NATO underestimated Russia's patience and its ability to endure a prolonged war of attrition, which has now proven to be a decisive advantage. This strategic mismatch has been exacerbated by a key failure of NATO's industrial base. Modern warfare on this scale is not just about what happens on the battlefield. It's about the capacity to sustain military production, maintain logistics, and adapt to changing operational realities. While Russia transitioned its economy to sustain high levels of military output, NATO struggled to keep pace. Russia's ability to produce artillery, drones, missiles, and glide bombs at mass production levels far exceeded NATO's ability to respond in kind. The West's reliance on expensive, specialized systems delivered in limited quantities proved inadequate when confronted with the sheer volume and persistence of Russia's military output. As the conflict dragged on, NATO's industrial base remained largely on a peacetime footing, constrained by cost, bureaucracy, and political hesitation. Meanwhile, Russia's military industries adapted quickly, producing the necessary equipment and supplies to maintain constant pressure on Ukraine. This industrial imbalance gave Russia the edge it needed to sustain its operations, particularly in the Black Sea region, where Russia was able to steadily degrade Ukraine's infrastructure without facing significant resistance from NATO. The result of this imbalance is a major shift in the strategic landscape of the Black Sea. Russia now controls not just the sea lanes to Odessa, but also the means of economic and military access to much of Ukraine's southern region. The balance of power is tipped decisively in Russia's favor, and the consequences for NATO are profound. The alliance must now confront the reality that its strategy has failed to prevent Russia from achieving its key objectives in the region. For Ukraine, the opening of the Odessa corridor is nothing short of a strategic catastrophe. Odessa was the last remaining deep-water port capable of sustaining Ukraine's vital export economy. With this port effectively neutralized, Ukraine faces the loss of a quarter of its export revenue, which directly undermines its ability to finance its military and maintain essential public services. The global impact is equally severe. Ukrainian grain, which has long played a stabilizing role in food markets across North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, is now subject to Russian control. Moscow has effectively gained the power to dictate global food flows, positioning itself as a stabilizing force in the global south while framing Western sanctions as the source of instability. This geopolitical leverage is a powerful tool for Russia, allowing it to further erode Western influence in the global arena. The Black Sea, once seen as a peripheral theater, is now at the center of global competition with far-reaching implications for energy flows, food security, and international trade. The Odessa corridor has transformed the conflict from a regional dispute into a global issue, forcing NATO to confront the reality of its weakened position. The human cost of this strategic shift cannot be ignored either. As Odessa and other coastal cities face continued pressure, civilian displacement will increase, adding strain to neighboring countries and Europe's already strained migration systems. Over time, the psychological toll of living under siege conditions will erode the resilience of Ukraine's population, further weakening the country's ability to resist Russian advances. This is not just a military defeat, it is a long-term economic, social, and political challenge that will reverberate throughout the region for years to come. For NATO, this shift in the balance of power represents a major strategic failure. The alliance's reluctance to fully commit the necessary resources to secure Ukraine's maritime sovereignty has now led to the loss of its most vital economic asset. NATO must now reckon with the consequences of its failure to deter Russia and its inability to respond effectively to the shifting dynamics of the conflict. The West's strategy of slow, calculated support for Ukraine has proven ineffective, and the consequences of this inaction are now clear. The opening of the Odessa corridor is not the end of the conflict, but rather the beginning of a far more dangerous phase. Russia now holds the initiative, and NATO is left scrambling to respond. The Black Sea has become a zone of direct competition, with Russia holding escalation dominance and NATO on the defensive. The stakes of this conflict have grown immeasurably, and the choices made by NATO in the coming months will determine not just the future of Ukraine, but the security framework of Europe itself. The strategic impact of the Odessa corridor cannot be understated. What was once a regional conflict confined to Ukraine has now escalated into a direct challenge to the Western alliance's credibility. The corridor has become a symbol of Russia's growing dominance in the Black Sea, and with it, a stark reminder of NATO's failure to deter Russian advances. This development has profound consequences not only for Ukraine, but for the entire geopolitical order that the West has tried to uphold in the region. As the Black Sea becomes increasingly contested, NATO finds itself in a position where it must either accept Russia's actions or take significant steps to reverse them. The options available are few, and none come without considerable risk. Accepting the situation means acknowledging a major strategic defeat, one that could have lasting ramifications for the West's influence in Europe and beyond. Contesting the corridor, however, carries the risk of escalating the conflict into something much broader and more dangerous. The most likely scenario, at least in the near term, is that Russia consolidates its control over the Odessa corridor without launching a costly urban assault on the city itself. By maintaining dominance in the Black Sea and over Odessa's neighboring ports, Moscow could achieve its strategic goals without engaging in direct street fighting or attempting a full occupation. In this scenario, Odessa would remain formally under Ukrainian control, but its economic function would be effectively neutralized. The city would no longer serve as a viable port for Ukraine, as its ability to engage in global trade would be severely restricted. This form of control is more insidious than a traditional military conquest. While Ukraine could still technically claim sovereignty over Odessa, it would be rendered economically impotent. Grain exports, steel shipments, and commercial shipping, all critical to Ukraine's survival, would either be regulated, delayed, or outright denied by Russia. The country's maritime economy would be quietly annexed, with Moscow dictating the terms of trade and effectively reducing Ukraine's economic capacity. This approach would allow Russia to control up to 30% of Ukraine's export revenue, significantly weakening the country's financial position. In this scenario, Ukraine would remain territorially intact in certain areas, but its ability to function as a viable state would be greatly constrained. The country would become more dependent on inefficient and vulnerable land routes through Europe, which would further isolate it from the global economy. This would mark a significant shift from the hope of maintaining an open Ukrainian economy to the harsh reality of a nation trapped in a logistical straitjacket. The opening of the Odessa corridor in this context is not just a territorial loss, it's an economic and strategic defeat that dramatically reshapes the conflict's trajectory. The focus of the conflict could then shift westward towards Transnistria, a Russian-backed breakaway region in Moldova. Once the coastal flanks are secured, establishing a land connection to Transnistria becomes a relatively low-risk operation for Russia. This would complete the southwestern arc of control that Russia has long envisioned, and it would represent a significant expansion of its influence into Moldova, a country that has remained outside of NATO's protective umbrella. This shift would have profound implications for NATO, particularly for Romania, which is now directly exposed to a Russian-controlled corridor running parallel to its border. Romania, a NATO member, would suddenly find itself in a more precarious position. The pressure on NATO to respond to this new reality would intensify, as the alliance's credibility would be placed in serious jeopardy. Romania's security, which was once guaranteed by NATO's collective defense, would now be at risk of being directly threatened by a resurgent Russia. The most dangerous possibility, however, lies in NATO's potential attempt to reverse the situation by force. Under mounting political and domestic pressure, the alliance could be tempted to deploy its naval assets or advanced air defense systems directly into the Odessa region. The stated goal would be to secure free passage for commercial shipping and restore access to Ukrainian ports. However, such an intervention would carry a high risk of direct confrontation with Russian forces. The Black Sea would quickly become a flashpoint, and the potential for escalation would grow exponentially. If NATO were to deploy forces to challenge Russia's control over Odessa, the conflict could easily spiral out of control. Russia would likely respond with a barrage of long-range missile strikes targeting newly introduced NATO assets. Air defenses would be forced into combat roles, and the risk of miscalculation would rise sharply. Any exchange of fire, even limited, would risk triggering a broader military confrontation. The consequences of such an escalation would reach far beyond Ukraine, with the potential to draw NATO into a direct conflict with Russia. The underlying danger here is psychological as much as military. Once credibility starts to erode, it creates immense pressure on leaders to take action, even if that action isn't strategically sound. History has shown that escalation often begins not as a deliberate choice, but as an attempt to restore lost authority under political pressure. The opening of the Odessa corridor has already demonstrated how quickly the balance can shift in this conflict. NATO now faces the uncomfortable reality of either accepting its defeat or risking a broader confrontation that it may not be prepared to sustain. For NATO, the stakes are higher than just the defense of Ukraine. The alliance's credibility, its ability to deter further Russian aggression, and its influence in the region all hinge on how it responds to the opening of the Odessa corridor. With the Black Sea now firmly under Russian control, the alliance must decide whether it can afford to let this moment pass or whether it must escalate the conflict to regain lost ground. The choices made in the coming months will have far-reaching consequences, not only for Ukraine, but for the entire European security architecture. The opening of the Odessa corridor is more than just a shift in military dynamics. It is the beginning of a new phase in the conflict, one that will test NATO's strategic resolve and reshape the future of European security. What has occurred in the Black Sea is not a one-off event, but a strategic maneuver that positions Russia to control not only the maritime routes leading to Odessa, but also the geopolitical future of the region. The consequences of this move will ripple through global politics, economics, and security for years to come. At its core, the opening of the Odessa corridor represents a direct challenge to NATO's fundamental assumption that it could maintain a stable, Western-dominated security architecture in Europe. For years, the alliance has worked under the premise that Russia could be contained or deterred through conventional military power and economic sanctions. However, this strategy has now been proven flawed. The Black Sea, once viewed as a peripheral theater, is now a critical front in the struggle for global dominance, and Russia holds the upper hand. For NATO, this moment of reckoning is not just about Ukraine, it's about the future of its own credibility. The alliance has spent years painting a picture of Ukrainian victory, while in reality, its support has been insufficient to secure Ukraine's most critical economic and military assets. The failure to prevent Russia from opening the Odessa corridor is a clear indication that NATO's policy of slow, calculated restraint has been ineffective. The West's commitment to the conflict was always half-hearted, driven more by political messaging and short-term electoral concerns than by a genuine desire to achieve long-term strategic success. This flaw in NATO's strategy is compounded by the alliance's failure to understand the broader implications of the conflict. While Western leaders focused on the land war in eastern Ukraine, Russia methodically targeted Ukraine's maritime economy. The Black Sea was treated as a secondary concern, even though it was the critical pressure point for Ukraine's survival. As a result, Russia was able to steadily degrade Ukraine's naval and logistical capabilities, eventually opening the Odessa corridor without ever needing to engage in a direct assault on the city. The strategic oversight by NATO has now left the alliance in a position where it must either accept Russia's new dominance in the region or take actions that could escalate the conflict beyond control. The opening of the Odessa corridor is also a wake-up call for NATO's industrial and logistical capabilities. Russia's ability to sustain its military operations through a robust, mobilized industrial base has proven decisive. In contrast, NATO has struggled to match Russia's pace of production, relying on expensive, specialized systems that have been delivered in limited quantities. This industrial gap has made it impossible for NATO to sustain the level of support needed to counter Russia's persistent pressure on Ukraine's infrastructure. As a result, Russia has been able to steadily erode Ukraine's defensive position in the Black Sea, undermining its ability to resist further advances. This industrial imbalance is particularly evident in the Black Sea region, where Russia has been able to increase the density and reach of its long-range anti-ship and land attack missiles. These systems have allowed Russia to effectively block Ukraine's access to the sea without needing to deploy a full naval blockade. Instead, Russia has created a passive blockade, making commercial shipping through the Black Sea too risky to be viable. As insurance premiums skyrocketed and shipping routes were rerouted, Ukraine's ability to engage in international trade became severely limited. This economic strangulation is one of the primary reasons why Odessa's importance cannot be overstated. It was the last remaining lifeline for Ukraine's economy. The implications of this new reality for NATO are profound. The Black Sea is no longer just a geopolitical theater. It is a vital zone of competition where Russia now holds the upper hand. For NATO, the strategic challenge is no longer about merely defending Ukraine, but about maintaining credibility in the face of Russian aggression. The alliance must now confront the reality that it failed to prevent Russia from securing its key objectives in the region. The Odessa corridor is a stark reminder that NATO's strategy of gradual, calibrated support has not been enough to counter Russia's resolve in its long-term planning. This moment forces a reevaluation of Western strategy. The balance of power in Europe has shifted, and the Black Sea is now at the center of that shift. NATO must decide whether it will accept Russia's dominance in the region or risk escalating the conflict further. Any military response carries significant risks, including the potential for direct confrontation with Russian forces. Yet, not responding carries its own dangers. A weakening of NATO's strategic position in Europe, a loss of credibility, and a further erosion of the alliance's deterrence capabilities. The opening of the Odessa corridor is not the end of the conflict. It is a turning point that sets the stage for the next phase of the war. Russia has already demonstrated its ability to shape the conflict on its terms, and NATO must now reckon with the consequences of its failure to anticipate and counter Russia's strategy. The alliance will need to make hard choices in the coming months, and the decisions it makes will determine the future of European security and the global balance of power. One of the most significant questions moving forward is how the West will respond to Russia's new maritime dominance. Will NATO seek to challenge Russia's control of the Black Sea, or will it accept the reality of Russian strategic victory? Whatever the decision, it will require a fundamental shift in Western strategy. The focus must move beyond the immediate battlefield and toward the broader geopolitical implications of Russia's actions. The Odessa corridor represents the first phase of a much larger struggle for control of Europe's maritime access, and NATO must decide how far it is willing to go to contest it. The implications of this decision extend far beyond Ukraine. The opening of the Odessa corridor has already reshaped the security environment in the Black Sea, but its impact will be felt across Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. As Russia solidifies its control over the Black Sea, NATO will be forced to confront the reality of a changing global order, one where Russia, not the West, holds the strategic initiative.